Chapter 11. August 29th, 1298. Badajoz, Spain. The reddish-orange glow of fire always fascinated Hernan. As it tirelessly danced under the pot holding the evening's meal, it made him think about the good times he enjoyed with his family around this fireplace, especially with his twin brother. His heart yearned for the days when all he had to do was glance over to the other side of the room and see his brother. He thought about the first time one of them fell in love, the first time one of them had a child, even the first time one of them was spanked. The two of them shared each event in their respective lives. If one of them fell and scraped a knee, the other wouldn't rest until it was tended to, almost as if there was an unseen mental bridge between them. Hernan and Arturo were inseparable, even though they now lived miles apart, each with their own respective farms and families.
"You are lost once again in the fire, aren't you?"
asked Sophia. Hernan's wife, Sophia, looking on from her rocking chair, contemplated the thoughts shuffling through her husband's mind, wishing she could be part of his world more than she already was. This cottage where they lived held many memories for her, but it held much more than memories for Hernan. It held life. Here was where he first took in the breath of life, alongside his twin, Arturo. Sophia came from a family of her own with memories of her own. The Montero family, an influential clan in the same village, headed by an equally influential father. Now that she lived in this cottage with her husband, however, it was his family that seemed to take up most of her attention. "Yes, I suppose I was, my love. After working as hard as I do, only my mind has the strength to play," replied Hernan. Hernan thought about how many memories this house held for him. Most of them were good. Some of them were bad. Tonight was to be a good one for Hernan and Sophia. Arturo was going to pay a visit and bring his wife Valera and his only child, Joselito. The sun had set long ago, and the tools from the day's work had grown cold. Hernan was well lost in thoughts of his mother and father when the knock came. He jumped up, swinging open the door to Arturo and his family. "Arturo, mi hermano y mi amigo, come in and warm yourself by the fire," exclaimed Hernan. "Hernan, it is good to see you," returned Arturo. Hearty embraces were exchanged between the brothers, as if there was no tomorrow, as if tonight was the last time to tell each other of their mutual love. That was their way. Growing up, Hernan and Arturo were different from other boys in the village. Even though all the others regularly fought with their siblings, Hernan and Arturo could always be seen walking through the trees together, or sitting next to the creek together, or napping together. They never rivaled each other. They shared a bond nobody else had, nor understood. That is not to say life for them was easy. Even though their father was a well-respected member of the community, the other boys would always find a way to tease them. Identical twins were exceedingly rare. So rare, in fact, it took time for some of the more superstitious villagers to believe the two brothers were not an evil apparition. Even with a degree of reverence among the older ones of Badajoz, Hernan and Arturo still suffered from the sometimes cruel tongues of boyhood bullies. As they embraced, Hernan noticed a box under Arturo's arm. "What is this?" Hernan questioned. "You haven't brought me another rock, have you?" They both laughed. Valera looked a little puzzled at the comment as she sat down by Sophia with Joselito on her lap. Her sister-in-law could see that a little explanation was needed.
"You see," Sophia offered, "when they were young, Arturo took a liking to the way some rocks in the mountains shined, and how they had many different colors, especially when they were wet. Well, one day Arturo found this particular rock and thought it was one of the most beautiful he had ever seen. He picked it up, brought it home, washed it off, and then presented it as a gift to his father, Diego. Knowing how much he loved his sons, you can imagine what a fuss he made over this gift, given from the heart of his little boy. Diego promptly took the rock and placed it on the mantel, right there.
Sophia pointed toward the fireplace. There on the right side of the mantel was the rock Diego had placed there some 25 years ago.
After that,
Sophia continued,
Arturo was always bringing home rocks to his family as gifts. As he got older, the gift-giving slowed down to a stop. However, the family story continued, and is still alive and well.
With a look of newfound understanding, Valera glanced at her husband and saw he and his brother had moved to a warm spot on the hearth. They were catching up on the latest news and talking about the gift Arturo brought his brother. Wanting to be with the men, Joselito protested at the hold his mother had on him. Valera allowed him to leave and take his place next to his father and uncle. "Not quite, my brother. This is a gift I myself have made for you," Arturo replied with a look of mock disdain. "Lately I've had a lot of time on my hands, since hurting myself while caring for the grounds at the church last Sunday." "Hurt at the church?" Hernan's countenance fell. "What happened?" "I am a little embarrassed to admit it, since it was a pretty stupid thing to do," explained Arturo. "I had just finished planting a new set of poles for that fence around the church. After working a full day at this, I found myself at the eastern side of the building. After stopping for some water Valera had brought, I noticed I was in the exact spot where I was standing when Mother died." Sophia raised her eyes and looked up with a sharp movement. She was silently surprised at even the mention of the subject. Arturo paused, as it was hard to say, and he knew it was hard for Hernan to hear as well. "For the longest time, I just tried to avoid that place, but—" Arturo exhaled loudly. "It is strange how life just sneaks up, forcing you to face memories you would rather forget." Both brothers paused. Arturo gazed into the fire to contemplate the feelings now floating freely in the room. Hernan's eyes drifted from Arturo's face and began to stare off into distant space. It was a place in the dark recesses of his mind he dared not go, a dark place where the demons of one's past live. A long silence ensued, accented only by the sound of the wind outside and the crackle of the warm fire inside. "Anyway," Arturo continued after regaining his composure, "as I was standing there lost in thought, I took a step forward to get a closer look at the window sill she must have been sitting on when it happened. I completely forgot I had just dug a hole in front of me. My foot went in, I fell and twisted it so badly, I thought it might be broken. Fortunately, Dr. Fernandez said it was just twisted up, and should be back to normal in a few days." Arturo handed the box to Hernan. "Anyway, this is something I carved for you while sitting on my porch all day long last week." Hernan accepted the gift with graciousness, and, after opening the box, was surprised to discover an intricately carved wooden rock. Hernan laughed so hard he nearly slid off his chair. Joselito smiled as if he knew what the joke was about, but his youthful innocence showed through, betraying another thought floating in his mind. Arturo was more than pleased with his brother's reaction, and for a moment glanced over to his wife with a look of true pleasure. Once Hernan regained his composure, he took the rock and placed it next to the original rock on the mantel that was given to their father. From across the room, Valera could see the look in Joselito's face, and somehow knew the next words out of her son's mouth were going to be uncomfortable. "Father," said the little voice,
Where are grandmother and grandfather?
There it was. Valera knew that since it was Arturo who brought up the subject, it was up to him to explain what had happened. It surprised her that the question hadn't been asked before now, since Diego visited this village so rarely these days, and was so conspicuously absent in the life of his grandson. This was a painful memory for her husband, so she had wisely decided to avoid the whole subject. She knew, though, that this simple and sincere question, from the fruit of his loins now standing before him, could not be disregarded. Her husband would now have to answer that question, and she might have some questions answered about that day. Hernan wished this night didn't have to be punctuated by the painful story. However, he knew it was one which had to be told. "My little one," Arturo spoke slowly in a way depicting one recounting a fond memory, "your grandmother was one of the kindest, most loving and joyful women I have ever known. Many commented about the way Grandfather Diego loved his sons, but that was just because he was a man who wasn't afraid to show you how he felt. Grandmother wasn't so public in her displays of affection. However, in private, she made you feel as safe and warm as the fire in this fireplace. When we were little boys, afraid of the wind outside," Arturo glanced up at the roof he stared at so many times when going to sleep as a boy, "she would get into bed with us, allowing us to fall asleep under the warm protection of her arms. She was always free with her expressions of affection to her children, and I remember the soothing feeling I always had when I saw her in the loving embrace of your grandfather. Grandmother Maria was always a very faithful one in the church." "Sí, hermano," added Hernan. "There were many orphans after the fighting with the pagans, and there wasn't any place for them to stay. Mother decided to lead a movement to build the orphanage next to the church. 'We'll need God's help to look after these little ones,' was what she would say. I remember some of her friends joking about how she practically built the orphanage by herself, since she spent so much time there. She really didn't, but if she had the chance, I think she would have tried. She never neglected her own children, though, and I respect her for that, as well as many other things. Your father and I were too young to remember our older sister Anna. When she died from something with her breathing, Father said Mama was heartbroken, and that probably had something to do with why she felt so close to the orphans. When she went to the orphanage to help with the care of the children, she took us too. She told us not only to be proud of who and what we are, but tempered that by pointing out how fortunate we were to have a mother and a father." "I remember her telling us that so many times," said Arturo. There was a short pause while he gathered enough courage to continue. "After the wars," said Arturo, "things were very different on the farm. Before, it was tough to carve out an existence and supply your family with food. But now that we had the benefit of pagan servants to do much of the shepherding here on our farms, Father had more time to spend on other things he felt were more important. Your grandfather was a very brave fighter in the name of God, and he, along with many of the men back then, was very zealous in eradicating the domination the pagan Moors had over this land for so long. After most of the battles were won, he volunteered off duty along the Granada border. It was an honor to be part of that knighthood." Arturo's words slowed as he carefully chose each syllable. "One day, when Father was away on a campaign, Mother took us to the church as she always did. Hernan and I were almost 18 years old, and we felt a little strange, still being led around by Mother. I intended to talk with her about it later, but I never got to." Arturo shifted his sitting position, obviously uncomfortable with the subject. Just like it is today, it was customary back then to do a thorough cleaning of the church once a year. And this particular day was the day to clean. Mother's job was to clean the windows above the altar to the right. There are windows on the ground floor, but there are others much higher up that need cleaning. She had to use a ladder to reach them. As she was cleaning these windows, she commented to one of the other women the windows needed to be cleaned on the outside as well, because it just wouldn't do to have God looking down upon his congregation through dirty windows. Arturo paused. She climbed onto the ledge of the window, holding onto one of the stone outcroppings which framed the window. The stone she held onto wasn't seated very securely. As soon as she put her weight on it, it gave way, and she fell out of the window. I saw it happen. She landed on her head. Arturo's words came in short sentences, measured and articulate. She died, faster than I could even run to her side. I fell next to her. I held her body, but there was no life in it. Still warm, but no life. Sophia bowed her head in sorrow. Though she and Hernan weren't married at the time, she remembers having witnessed the scene. She remembered how pitiful it was to hear Arturo and Hernan cry out at the top of their voices in anguish over having lost their mother right before their eyes. She remembered the deafening sorrow in the faces of all who watched them take their mother back to the family farm to bury her. Once again there was silence in the room. Nobody wanted to break it, as if speaking would be disrespectful to Maria's memory. Finally, Arturo spoke again. When Father found out a few weeks later that his wife was dead, he was devastated. Hernan looked up and nodded. He came home, and all he saw was a mound of dirt, where his life-mate and friend now lay dead. After that, he lived without purpose at the farm. You could always hear him plodding around the farm saying, "If I had only been there, if I had only been there." Over and over he repeated that, added Hernan. Nothing we said or did made him feel any better, and God forbid we should try getting him to start enjoying life again. Somehow I think he believed that if he enjoyed anything now, it somehow meant he wasn't faithful to the memory of Mother, as if being miserable now would prove how much he loved her. It was hard on all of us, but especially troublesome on Father. True, very true, agreed Arturo. He paused. After some time, a few of Father's friends convinced him that he needed to get out of this house, which held so many memories of his wife. They told him he needed to get on with his life and start enjoying things a little. At the start he resisted, but slowly began seeing there was life beyond this terrible tragedy, and that once again he could find peace. When he finally realized Mother would want him to be happy, he signed on to help with the caravan, which regularly made its way across the mountain ranges to the east, trading with cities that were several months' journey farther beyond. Later, he told us how he met people who looked strange, and how they made a material out of the web of an insect. It was a little hard to believe his tall tales, but we still loved to hear of these faraway lands and all the adventures he experienced on the way. It makes me happy to know he is happy. In fact, Joselito, your grandfather continues to do this to this very day. Valera quietly gasped, but it was loud enough for Sophia to look over at her sister-in-law and notice she was crying. "What did you and Uncle Hernan do then?" asked Joselito. "Well, since Father was gone for most of the time, answered Arturo. And the farm was mostly run by servants, but especially since this house held too many memories for us as well, your uncle and I decided we needed to leave. We weren't certain what we would do, but after hearing some exciting stories about voyages over the ocean, we decided to sign up as sailors on the first ship we could find. Actually, it was very easy for us to find work because the captains took one look at us and demanded we sail with them. You see, sailors are very superstitious, and they thought having two men who looked exactly alike would confuse the evil spirits, and they would be left alone.
Hernan chuckled.
After sailing for 5 years, said Arturo, your uncle and I decided we longed for families of our own, so we left our ship and returned home. We found our wives, and it was then, my boy— Arturo ceremoniously grabbed the shoulders of his young son— that God blessed me with you, my own precious son.
Although Joselito was sad to hear the story of how his grandmother had died, he glowed in the pleasant warmth of his father's embrace and loving remarks. Joselito crawled into his father's lap and gave Arturo the biggest hug he could possibly manage. Meanwhile, Sophia was taking more and more notice of Valera and how she was continuing to sob quietly. Her moist eyes seemed to be transfixed on the floor in front of her, and she had a look on her face resembling something unexpected— fear. After enjoying his son's embrace, Arturo looked over to his wife, and rather than seeing an approving smile, he saw a look of deep and profound sorrow on her face. Arturo rose from his position in front of the fire and strode to his wife's side.
Valera, my love,
consoled Arturo,
do not be downhearted. Mother is with God now, and she is in a wonderful place. Please don't cry for her, because she isn't suffering at all. She is at peace now, and would be pleased to know we can fondly remember her for the good she did.
Arturo came close to Valera and cradled her head on his chest. After a few seconds of enjoying her husband's consolations, Valera decided she was no longer able to hold back what was burning inside her. She had to come forth with it, and Arturo would have to hear it. She just wished to God it did not have to come from her lips.
"With no disrespect to the memory of your mother,"
said Valera, as she pulled away from her husband's embrace,
"I wish the cause of my tears was as simple as that. But no. My heart is heavy with news I heard just 2 days ago when I was shopping at the markets in town. My heart is heavy, for I know this is news you must hear. However, I was afraid to tell you because I knew it would cause you so much pain."
"What is it?" asked Arturo, bracing himself. "What did you hear?"
Valera looked up from the spot where she had been staring, looked Arturo in the eyes, and said,
"Diego, your father, is dead."
Hey, fellow Galimarians, this is Dan Adrian, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my book. If you can, please click like down below, because it really helps me bring these videos to you and lets me know what you like. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and click on the bell so that you'll get notified when I release more chapters.